I suppose this is your first CS course, at least most of you. And I'm going to introduce the course generally. This is a story. Somebody said the world is not made up of atoms, it's made up of stories. And well, atoms have their story as well. But I want to tell you the story of philosophy, or a major tradition in philosophy. And philosophy, Plato tells us, starts in wonder. Now, my daughter is a wanderer by profession. She's like 6, and she keeps asking these questions. She settles some of them. I feel she's done with the part which has to do with God and theology, so we know what needs to be known. We know the color of God. Can you make a guess? Anybody? What's the color of God? Come on. Say again. White. Don't be ridiculous. It's green, of course it's green. And she knows now that before she was born, she was with God, which doesn't exactly make her a God, but somehow godlike, which is very interesting for our purposes. She also asks questions that philosophers might call epistemological, like about knowledge. Does a little child know that it's a little child? But her main concern is metaphysical questions, questions about reality. So are ogres real? Do they exist? Is Shrek real? Is Shrek real the way donkeys are real? Or do we have speaking donkeys? When it comes to the Jungle Book, it's easy to sort out, like animals that speak are not real and those who do not are real. But it can get complicated. For example, in SpongeBob, the movie, Burger Beard the pirate, here can be, Antonio Banderas, by the way, can be thrown through a cannon and then fall down just as fine. So how do we delineate the question of reality? It's more complicated than that. Obviously, SpongeBob is real. He's there, he makes us laugh. But the question is whether we can reduce this reality to something which is more basic. What is really real in this case? The bits and pixels, the original etchings on paper, the stuff in the imagination of the guy who first came up with the idea. You see? And the imagination is a tough part. So if we ask whether the imagination is real or not, because some people would want us to think or defend the case that only neurons or synapses are real. Some others would go deeper and say only atoms and molecules are real. So the question of reality is whether there is something which underlines the reality the way we know it. Okay, this is a basic issue we're going to be discussing. What is real? But there is another question the authors you'll be reading are concerned with, and this is the question of the kind of life we should live. Okay? In some cases, this is quite obvious. So, you know the guy, Scrat? For Scrat, what he wants in life is the acorn, not Scratty. Okay? And it's fixed in. So this is a man, or whatever he is, of a singular purpose. The rest of us have to figure out what it is that we want in life for ourselves. Actually, since most of us are lazy, somebody else figures it out for us. I want to say that the two questions are not really separate. The question of what is real and the question of the kind of life we should be living. For Plato, for example, these two are quite intertwined. For Plato, reality is, there are two worlds, to put it in simple terms. There is the world of appearances that we live in, the world of senses, the world we're familiar with, the world of continuous flux and change. But there is something beyond it which gives it its reality. The world that we live in has a borrowed or surrogate reality. And it borrows its reality from what he calls the world of forms or ideas. And whereas this world is changing in continuous flux, imperfect, the other world, the world of forms, is eternal, is immutable, it does not change. And when you get to know this other world, what is really real, then you have achieved your purpose in life. So our aim is to get there, and once we get there, through subjecting our life to examination. Once we get there, we become godlike. So if we don't do that, we fall short of what we are intended to achieve. The unexamined life is not worth living. You might disagree, of course. But for Plato, the unexamined life, which makes you at the end of the day, or ultimately godlike, this is a process of theosis, or deification, becoming God. This is connected to coming to know reality. So knowledge makes you godlike. See? Not the certificate, let alone an MBA, real knowledge, or knowledge of what is real. That's the same. And as you get there, since this is a transformative process, you move away from this world of change that we live in, the world of appearances, and you approach the world of forms. Actually, originally you came from there, because when we say we, when we point to ourselves, what we mean is not this body. This body belongs to this world of perishables, disposables, okay? But our soul does not, our soul is more divine. And this is something that we can do in our life. Actually, Plato, see, we ought to fly away from earth to heaven as quickly as we can. To fly away is to become like God, okay? But then he qualifies as far as this is possible. People usually forget qualifications. You tell someone, I'll tell you something, keep it between us. They remember the something, they forget the between us. So qualifications seem to elude us. Anyhow, becoming God is something that Socrates here managed to do. At the moment of death, he was pointing out to a reality which is higher than this material world, where you find happiness, and you find happiness again through knowledge. So again, for Plato, we have this ephemeral reality, and we have what is really real. And what is really real, which is populated by these forms or ideas, like for every chair in this world, there is a perfect form of the chair, without which these regular chairs that you sit on would not exist. So they establish the reality of this world. They do more than that for us. I discuss it very briefly in your fly sheets, whatever we want to call them at one point. But these are very crucial for Plato's theory. Let's not go very far away. Socrates was killed in Athens because he was supposedly corrupting the youth and introducing new gods to the city, something that we at the CS program do in a more systematic and supposedly more successful fashion than Socrates. But you should be familiar with Master Oogway. Master Oogway at the end of Ice Age, actually, Kung Fu Panda Part 1, disappears into a storm of cherry petals, you remember? So this is with Hans Zimmer in the background, the music. So this signifies the dissolution of the body. Of course, he comes up again in Kung Fu Panda Part 3 because the death of the body does not mean death. There is the real life beyond the body. But the point is not simply that the body dissolves, the point is that he has achieved wisdom and happiness and serenity. Okay? There are issues with the theory of forms. Plato was aware of them, and he subjected some of these issues to scrutiny. But the guy who did much of the scrutiny and argued most forcefully against the theory of forms was a Plato student, Aristotle. 20 years a student of Plato at the academy in Athens. For Aristotle, we look at several chairs, and then our mind or our reason, our intellect has the capacity to abstract a universal, a concept, which is the universal chair. You see many circles, all of them imperfect because they're part of this material world, according to Plato. But our mind can draw a perfect circle, which can never be made to materialize. See? So for Aristotle, this more perfect circle only exists because of these less perfect circles. For Plato, these less perfect circles could not exist without the more perfect one. You see, the relationship is inverted. Okay, the universal, the concept for Aristotle depends on these particular imperfect instances or instantiations of the concept, the chairs, the lousy chairs that render you sleepy. See? For Plato, these would not exist if that universal did not exist first. So whereas in Plato, the universal is primary, for Aristotle, the universal is parasitic and dependent upon the particulars. That's very crucial. And you'll see why. Anyhow, goodbye to the forms. They are idle prattle, and if they do exist, they are wholly irrelevant. That's a bit harsh. Especially that the theory of forms was the darling of Plato. For Aristotle, the kind of access to things, the kind of perspective which he depended on to see things is more biological. The man was a biologist. He had groundbreaking research in biology. Plato is more leaning towards mathematics. That's why he thinks that these perfect entities of mathematics give us or provide us with the model for reality. So Aristotle's model was more organic. And organic in this sense. Sometimes we speak of organic unity and sometimes we speak of mechanical unity. The spoon is related to the cup in a mechanical relationship, but the inside of the cup and the outside of the cup are organically related. Try splitting them apart. Could you try doing that? Your reason can do that. Your reason can analyze the cup into an inner side and an outer side. But in reality, when you have a tangible, real cup of coffee, the kind of coffee that probably you're eager to have right now, then you cannot do this splitting. Okay? Outside there, this reality dictates what you can do and what you cannot. And this is the reality that matters. For Aristotle, this is what we have. So to say that there is some form of cupness out there which dictates or makes this reality of this particular cup real is extravagant, is redundant, is unnecessary. Okay? That's one crucial thing. Aristotle then gives us his famous theory of categories. Probably you'll discuss it in detail in class, where he says, we say that the cupness of the cup, so to speak, is its substance. There are other things that the cup has. The cup is white, it could have been blue, it could have been further away from the spoon, it could have been upside down. It could have been stuff are its accidents. Its color, its quality, its size. And if you take these away, the cup is still there. If you take the color white and give it blue, that's the same. But what you cannot take away is its substance. So we have one substance or essence, and we have 9 accidents. And these are the 10 categories. These accidents for Plato and Aristotle are what I've been calling universals. For Plato, there is some whiteness in the world of forms which dictates the whiteness of the cup. Okay? And so on and so forth. For Aristotle, again, these exist there in this complex material particular thing. It is primary. There's nothing beyond it. I want to move on. I had in mind discussing something which has to do with Aristotle's logical system, and mainly the syllogistic. You'll discuss this in class. Suffice it to say that Aristotle tried to refine the tools which would allow him to study the world scientifically, to categorize things. That's why we have the 10 categories, the accidents and the substance, and to test the scientific knowledge, and that's why he developed his logic. The syllogistic is the centerpiece of this logic, for reasons that you will see in class. Okay? The syllogistic is sometimes assumed to be productive of knowledge, but this is mistaken. For Aristotle, the syllogistic is simply a test of whether this scientific knowledge logic is consistent or not. It does not produce knowledge, no more than the coffee filter produces coffee. Okay, I won't discuss this further. I want to look at the cup again and see what is needed in order to furnish a scientific explanation of the cup. The categories are handy, they're useful. Okay? We need to know that it has these qualities, this weight, this size, etc. But we also, for a proper cause, for a proper scientific explanation, we need to, argues Aristotle, to look at the causes. And for Aristotle, there are 4 causes. If you look at this cup, it is made up of something, say clay or whatever. But clay on its own is not a cup of coffee. It needs to have a certain form. And there are limitations here. If the cup were flat, it's not a cup. Okay? So it has a certain form. It's not exactly its shape, but it's very much related to its shape. The way the key, the teeth of the key dictate its function, whether it's functional or not. Okay, but the form of the key is not simply its shape. And the form of the cup is not simply its shape. It's its essence. It is what makes it a cup rather than a spoon. So we need the form and we need the matter. Clay, to make it out, to make a cup of coffee out of clay, a cup out of clay. But we also need the form. We also need the potter. Otherwise, who's going to transform the clay into a cup? See? So matter, form, and the agent. The agent. But we also need some kind of plan in the mind of the potter. Some kind of blueprint. Some kind of design. And this is the form, actually. But this form is related to the 4th cause, which is the end towards which we're going to use the cup. We can use it for many purposes, right? We can throw it at each other. But ideally, you could store stuff in it. Ideally, you use it to drink coffee. So when the potter sets about to build something, to build this peculiar cup, he has this end in mind, or she has this end in mind. So for Aristotle to know something properly, we need these 4 causes. They are sufficient and necessary. The agent, the end, the purpose, the matter, and the form. But there is something about the matter and the form, because in time, Aristotle will make them more complex. He says, if this clay is the matter for the form, for the cup, then this clay has a potential to become a cup. So he starts understanding matter in terms of potentiality. And he starts understanding the form in terms of actuality. Only when this matter acquires this specific form does it become a cup of coffee, a cup actually. So matter is understood as potentiality, so, like when an acorn can become an oak tree. And when it has become the oak tree, it has acquired the form of oakness, which means its form gives it actuality. So Aristotle says, for instance, all humans by nature desire to know. An indication of this is etc. We all have the potential to know. But many of us run away from knowledge, right? We'd rather get beaten rather than sit down and read or get to know. But at least we have this potential within us to become philosophers, Aristotle would say. This potential might not be actualized. You might be hit by a bus, okay? Or you might buy an iPhone, okay? You stop reading, stuff like that. So for this potential to become actual, it's a different story. But you can still see the difference between potentiality and actuality. This is very, very crucial for a serious debate between Plato and Aristotle, or Platonists and Aristotelians. Because Aristotle thought that the body is the matter and the soul is the form. Whereas in Plato, the body is something which can survive without the soul. The body actually is the prison of the soul. And only when, with Oogway, only when you dissolve the body, when you break down this prison, can you really become yourself or fulfill your potential. For Aristotle, the body cannot exist without the soul. This has implications. This cup of coffee cannot exist without its form. If you break it down, it loses its form, but it's no longer a cup. If the implication is this, if the body dies, the soul is no more. Whereas for Plato, if the body dies, the soul is thriving, is liberated. You see the difference? It's crucial for our purposes because we're studying religious philosophers, or we're looking at religious philosophers in religious traditions. In these religious traditions, you don't want the soul to die when the body dies. So you will be siding with Plato. You will not be siding with Aristotle. For Aristotle, this kind of unity between the soul and the body is organic. It cannot be severed. You can analyze it, set the two apart in your mind, but you cannot set the two apart in reality. That's why when later philosophers wanted to appropriate or incorporate Aristotle, this meant that they will have to deal with this problem. And they do deal with this problem. Anyhow, Aristotle had to leave Athens when Plato died. Speusippus, a relative of Plato, became the head of the academy. And these guys here, very brilliant 20th century philosophers, logicians, Elizabeth Anscombe and Peter Geach, husband and wife, Catholics, probably among the top 20th century philosophers, suggest that Aristotle, because of his Macedonian background, couldn't really swallow the open homosexuality of the Athenians, and as such couldn't manage to go up in their hierarchy of power. Anyhow, Aristotle leaves, but then he comes back, and he comes back with a vengeance. He comes back, you know the guy? Alexander the Great. So Aristotle was his tutor for some time. And Alexander manages to achieve what the Athenians or all the Greeks failed to achieve, to bring unity to Greece. He actually does not only consolidate the unity of Greece, he brings much of the ancient world into unity. This is the Hellenistic world of Alexander the Great. He died, and he died in Iraq, somewhere here, Mesopotamia, but he went all the way to India. And as he went there, he brought with him the kind of culture or education that you find in Athens, but the world was not a void, okay? When he came to Egypt, he had to go all the way, out of his way, to the Amun oracle in Libya to pay tribute to the Egyptian guys. The Egyptian civilization had by then a couple of millennia to boast of. And, the state-of-the-art learning, you would go to Egypt at the time. Likewise in India and Mesopotamia and elsewhere. But this mixture of all of this stuff gives us the Hellenistic culture. In a later lecture by Professor Gubara, you will see that Arabia is not severed from these developments. Okay? When Alexander died, Aristotle had to leave Athens again, having established his own school there. He's supposed to have said that Athens is not to be allowed to sin against philosophy twice, because Athens has already killed Socrates. Anyhow, let me go back. Alexandria here becomes a very important center of learning, and the heirs to Alexander, the Ptolemaics, who adopt Egyptian religion, make sure that this becomes a very major center of learning. And in the 2nd century, 70 scholars come together to translate the Old Testament into Greek, from Hebrew to Greek, the sacred book for the Jews and later for the Christians. And that's why, because of the 70 scholars, we call this translation the Septuagint. So, 2 centuries later, so 2nd century, we have the translation of the Old Testament, rendering into Greek this kind of Hebrew culture and thinking, okay, Judaic culture and thinking, and also adding, since it's done in Egypt, bringing together an Egyptian element, Egyptian myth, very, very influential at the time. 2 centuries later, we have Philo the Jew, who's a contemporary of Jesus. And Philo was a Stoic. I haven't said anything about Stoicism, but we have Platonism, Aristotelianism, and then we have Stoicism as the 3 major schools at the time. Stoicism is interesting. One central idea in Stoicism is divine providence, is that there is some kind of divine reason which organizes the world. Nothing happens haphazardly. And being a Stoic and a Jew, Philo thought of Moses, the prophet of the Jews, as someone like Socrates, as a Greek-style philosopher. And he called this logos, or the reason which organizes the world, he called it God-begotten Son, or only begotten Son. That's why this kind of language was later taken by Christian thinkers. And Jesus himself is called the Logos. Of course, this doesn't mean that Christianity is a borrowing of different religions or bringing together of different elements that are not native. One could see this as a plan preparing the ground for the Christian breakthrough. And actually, much of religious thinking does this. Anyhow, another very influential figure and another contemporary of Jesus is St. Paul. And St. Paul had can be described as somehow influenced by Platonism. Philo, likewise, was a Stoic, but he was a Stoic paving the ground for the dominance of Platonism later on. Okay? 2 centuries further, around 180 AD, this is the Roman Empire of Marcus Aurelius. You can see why the Romans called the Mediterranean a Roman lake. Okay? The Romans inherited the Greeks, and many of the schools that the different philosophical schools of Greece were established and sponsored by Roman emperors. One such emperor is Marcus Aurelius. You might know the guy. He's the old man from Ridley Scott's movie, The Gladiator. His son kills him in the beginning of the movie. That's not true, probably. But what is true is that after Aurelius, we have what we call the Roman crisis. Aurelius was a philosopher, not just an emperor. He was a philosopher emperor, a very interesting figure. Many people still read his Meditations. I suggest that you read it. He reigned for something like 20 years. And in 176 AD, 4 years before he died, he went to Athens. And in Athens, he sponsored the 4 major schools of philosophy: Aristotelianism, Platonism, Stoicism, and Epicureanism. Okay? There are other schools that he didn't sponsor for reasons of his own. But sponsoring these schools has certain significations. These schools were separate, were like different cults. You dress in a certain way if you're a Platonist, in a different way if you're a Stoic. There are major commitments. It's not like you're majoring in modern studies or in postmodern studies. They are separate, and the separation is real. You cannot be a Platonist and a Stoic at the same time. But immediately after Aurelius, in what we call, again, the imperial crisis, some kind of eclectic thinking was on the rise. People were bringing elements from Platonism and Aristotelianism together. Actually, Aurelius himself was called a Stoic halfway to Platonism. And this is the crucial point, and this is where our course practically starts, in this period. It is called Late Antiquity, which coincides with the Roman imperial crisis. So you have a historian, Peter Brown, writing a book called Late Antiquity from Aurelius to Muhammad. This is the period. Okay, you know Muhammad, and you know a little about Aurelius now. What you need to know, I think, is that a new school of philosophy, somehow new, dominates everything else, Platonism. But to differentiate it from earlier Platonisms, like the Platonism that Aurelius sponsored was called Middle Platonism. This new Platonism, we call it Neoplatonism. And the major figure there is Plotinus, okay, who was born in Alexandria but established his school in Rome, I think. I'm not sure, actually, maybe in Athens. Plotinus definitely gives precedence to Platonism, but he brings all different schools together. There are serious Aristotelian elements there, definitely serious Stoic elements. But as of now, if you say philosophy, what you have in mind is Neoplatonism. When you read Augustine and he says philosophers, he means Neoplatonists. When you read Ghazali and he's attacking the philosophers, although this is a bit too later in time, much later in time, he means Neoplatonism. There are many variations of Neoplatonism. There is atheistic Neoplatonism, and there is Christian Neoplatonism, and Jewish and Muslim Neoplatonism. Okay, and there are local variations. But we have an umbrella for which we have under this umbrella all the different kinds of philosophical thinking at the time. Okay? Neoplatonism dominates. And let me tell you something about Neoplatonism. So for Plato, we have two realities. Well, one reality and something which derives its reality from. We have the world of forms or ideas of immutable entities, perfect entities, and we have the ephemeral world of mutable stuff, which we are part. Well, partly so. Part of us belongs in the world of forms, and part of us belongs in this material world. Okay? This setting allows Plato to solve many problems. One problem you will be concerned with is the problem of evil. So for Plato, there is no problem of evil. You have two principles. Okay? You don't have an absolute benevolent God who's the principle of everything. Because the problem of evil only arises if you admit such a God. If God is so powerful, so knowledgeable, so benevolent, how come there is evil in the world? But if God has besides him another principle, the world, then the world has its shortcomings. And if there is evil, you could blame the world. See? So, bottom line, Plato solves many problems. But then he engenders a new problem. If these two things, these two worlds are so separate, so unrelated, how can they connect? How can we be part of one and part of another? And Plotinus wanted to find a solution to this problem. For Plato, the mark of the real, to say that something is real, it needs a mark. And the mark of the real was, for Plato, immutability, that something does not change. Plotinus suggested a different mark for the real. For Plotinus, the mark of the real was oneness. If something was consolidated in oneness, it is real. The more consolidated, the more real it is. Okay? And there is no two principles of the world. The world does not come by combining two different aspects of reality. The world issues forth from one principle, which he calls it the one, which is beyond being, beyond understanding, beyond perfection. Avicenna will say, فوق التمام. And out of it, everything comes. So we don't have two principles. Supposedly, this solves Plato's problem, but it creates further problems. And the problem for Plotinus becomes, how do we have all this multiplicity out of something which is absolutely one, a simplex? See, if it's only one, how could it give rise? One in every possible respect. One in every possible way that comes to mind, or does not come to mind. How could all this multiplicity derive from the one? And he had to suggest a complicated scheme. He says the one, because of its perfection, it gives rise to other things. And the first thing it gives rise to, actually he uses the image, that's why I have this slide, the image of light or the image of the sun. In one sense, the sun is separate from the rays. We have the rays and we have the sun. And we have darkness and shadows. Okay? But in another respect, the rays cannot be separate from the sun. The rays of the sun are the sun itself. And only when we don't have the sun or its rays do we have darkness. And this is how he explains away or explains evil. See? The problem for him is to tell us that all this diversity in the world can be derived from one source. And this scheme is similar to the further away from the sun, the more complication and the more diversity you have. The first thing that issues forth or emanates from the sun, that's why you call it emanation, is what he calls the intellect. And the intellect is perfect in many respects, but it is not a simplex the way the one is, because it did not create itself. It did not bring about itself. Create is a problematic term here. Okay? And then the intellect gives rise to the soul. You'll discuss the procedure in class, hopefully. And then the soul gives rise to the material world. Every step of emanation, further multiplicity is introduced. Okay? This is a very neat scheme, and later Neoplatonists will introduce further steps into it. So we have many, many things emanating. Nowadays, we look at it somehow suspiciously, but it had its appeal at the time. Actually, it was quite overwhelming. Anyhow. So Plotinus thought of himself as a Platonist. Okay? That's why he called his school Platonism. But in time, Aristotle became, and nevertheless, it is Platonism, but unlike Middle Platonism, it is receptive of other schools of thought. As I said, it incorporates elements of Aristotelianism and elements of Stoicism within it. What I want to say is that this Aristotelian element in Neoplatonism becomes more prominent in time. Neoplatonism will survive as a dominant philosophical school for more than 1,000 years. And by the time Neoplatonism reaches the Arabs, 10th century, 9th century, 11th century, this means that Aristotle will become what the Arab calls al-Muallim al-Awwal, the first philosopher. It's no longer Platonism, actually. It's Neoplatonism, definitely. You see the elements there. But the central figure is Aristotle. Why? One reason is that Porphyry, this guy, the student of Plotinus, introduced into the curriculum of Neoplatonism Aristotle's logic. So students at Plotinus' school were supposed to study Aristotelian logic. And Porphyry had to do something about this major schism, major disagreement between Platonists and Aristotelians. The question of the categories. For Plato, the forms are primary, and because of them, everything else exists. For Aristotle, these particular things of the world are primary, and because of them, we have these universals or forms. See? So Porphyry had to come up with something, and he suggested that we are talking about two different things here. Plato is describing reality, whereas Aristotle is describing the way we understand reality. We talk about reality. So he makes a distinction between the order of reality and the order of description. Okay? And this makes Aristotelians and Platonists less tense when they sit together. In time, more Aristotle is incorporated, and Neoplatonism becomes more Aristotelian. Nevertheless, the Aristotle that you study in the Arabic tradition or the Muslim tradition is a thoroughly Platonized Aristotle. Porphyry from the 3rd and 4th century is sitting here with Ibn Rushd, 12th century. And Ibn Rushd is a strict Aristotelian. He was familiar with Neoplatonism. He was responding to Al-Ghazali, who was attacking Neoplatonism. But he's, later on, he will be called by the Europeans the interpreter. That is the interpreter of Aristotle, who they will describe as the philosopher. Okay? You see the connections? Anyhow, let's move on. Back to the 3rd, 4th century, after Plotinus, when Christianity became more dominant, there was a prominent Platonic school in Alexandria. The head of the school was Hypatia. Has anybody seen the film Agora? Okay, if you've seen it, well, she's a mathematician, astronomer, philosopher, and she was killed by angry Christians at the time. The assumption was that Christianity is not reconcilable with philosophy. But at the same time, actually, less than a century later, in nearby Algeria, we had Augustine, who was thoroughly defending the thesis that philosophy and Christianity can mutually benefit each other. Okay? So we have different points of views, and I could say that safely that the point of view of Augustine prevailed historically. There are issues with Augustine, a very interesting figure, very brilliant, you'll study in class. But we see a new tradition forming. Instead of all this Greek learning that characterized the period which we call classical antiquity, in late antiquity, very few people speak Greek. Actually, Augustine himself might not have known Greek. If he had known it, he doesn't really use it. And he had to rely on translations. One of his friends delivered a very prominent Latin translation of the Holy Book. which we call the Vulgate. So we have, and by the time that Augustine died, the Roman Empire was mostly collapsed. Okay? So the Roman Empire is almost gone, but we inherit from the Roman empires two things. The church, which inherits the institutions of Rome, which allows for a certain continuity with classical antiquity, and Latin. Latin. So although not everyone is speaking Greek at the time, we have an exception. We have this guy, Boethius, in the 5th century, who translates some of Aristotle's and Plato's work. He had in mind translating the rest of it, but he had a rope tightened around his head until his eyes bulged. He was put in jail and murdered at a young age, 44. There was an impression overall that this Western world was somehow severed from the classical world of antiquity. This classical world could speak to it, but it could speak to it indirectly because of Latin, because of the church institutions. But there was a sense which is similar to the sense of this guy, Buck, here. I like this part of the movie where these guys are saying, what's that sound? And he says, it's the wind, it's speaking to us. And then they say, what is it saying? And he says, I don't know, I don't speak wind. So the Christian Western world had this sense, and immediately it went into several centuries of what we call the Dark Ages. On the other side, we had the Arabs or the Muslims who were flourishing, establishing different schools. And here we have Aristotle carrying the astrolabe, the scientist. He's, again, a Platonized Aristotle. He didn't die at 88. He died at 61 or something like that. But the Arabs translated from Syriac and from Greek many of the works of Plato and Aristotle until the Westerners were capable again of handling this material. This is not to say that there were no contention over the study of Greek thinking in the Arab world. We have Ibn Taymiyyah here saying that if you study Aristotle's logic, you're being heretic. And there are more negative attitudes. I would mention some examples, but people used obscene language at the time. Al-Ghazali, who you will be reading, makes the study of logic legitimate, but this doesn't mean that he makes the rest of Greek learning legitimate. But I don't want to get ahead of myself. You deal with this material in class. Thank you.